The situation in Ukraine is rapidly evolving, and the continued American meddling in the conflict, while notable, has become increasingly irrelevant. The U.S. and European attempts to impose solutions, such as various peace plans or military solutions, are futile in the face of a clear Russian victory. The United States is scrambling to keep up, but their internal chaos, particularly with Trump's administration, reveals just how disjointed and ineffective their strategy has been. At the heart of this is a panic-driven attempt to maintain a facade of control in a conflict that has already shown its true outcome. The West has been militarily defeated. This defeat is significant, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire Western order. The collapse of Ukraine's military capability, coupled with Russia's steady advances, renders the West's influence meaningless. No matter how many points or resolutions are crafted, none will change the fact that the U.S. has overextended itself. The notion that Ukraine could field a military force of 600,000 soldiers is laughable. The real capacity of Ukraine, even before this war, was far less. This discrepancy between what is being claimed in Western circles and what is physically possible reflects the disconnect between the military-industrial complex of the West and the realities on the ground. Moreover, the United States has no real grasp of what it takes to fight a war of this scale. Its military, despite being equipped with the latest technology, lacks the fundamental knowledge of continental warfare. The U.S. military's focus on expeditionary missions and counterinsurgency operations leaves them ill-prepared for a war on the scale we are witnessing in Ukraine. The U.S. generals, who have never fought to defend their own borders, fail to understand the complexities involved in defending a country from a neighbor with superior military and logistical capabilities. The failure to comprehend this is part of why the U.S. has been unable to secure a victory in Ukraine. There is no chance that Ukraine could maintain an army of 600,000 troops, not only because of logistical and economic constraints, but because it simply does not have the infrastructure to support such a force. The Western political elite, however, seem to be oblivious to these fundamental realities, often proposing policies that ignore the basic principles of military strength. The persistent idea of imposing large armies and war budgets reflects the fantasies of American political and military elites, who, in many cases, have never fought in a real war. On the issue of territorial concessions, the West is trying to push narratives that depict Russia as the aggressor, but Russia's position is clear. The land that has been integrated into Russia is not negotiable. The West's maps, which show an ever-shrinking Ukraine, are nothing more than propaganda. Russia's strategy, particularly the creation of buffer zones, is part of its broader geopolitical plan to ensure that it never faces this kind of threat again. The future of Ukraine will likely see its western region split between Poland, Hungary, and other neighboring countries, with Russia solidifying its territorial gains. This brings us to the matter of Ukraine's sovereignty. The notion that Ukraine can be rebuilt as a viable, independent state aligned with NATO is delusional. The resources required to build such a state don't exist, and neither does the military capability to defend such an entity. The idea that NATO would somehow be able to support Ukraine against Russia indefinitely is based on a complete misunderstanding of the geopolitical and military realities. Furthermore, the corruption that permeates Ukraine is integral to understanding the West's involvement. Ukrainian leaders, including Zelensky, are simply the figureheads of a much larger and deeply entrenched corruption network. The European Union, the CIA, MI6, and various other interests are all involved in what can only be described as a massive money laundering operation. These funds, instead of going to the defense of Ukraine, are being funneled to corrupt elites who are profiting from the ongoing conflict. The seizure of Russian assets in European banks is another example of the desperation of the West. The European Commission, led by figures like Ursula von der Leyen, continues to push for the confiscation of Russian state assets. But this is not about Ukraine's reconstruction. It is about extending the war for as long as possible, even if it means further destabilizing the global financial system. The EU's ability to carry out such plans is questionable, especially as countries like Belgium are already hesitant about allowing such actions to proceed. The U.S., too, is entangled in this web of corruption and mismanagement. The Biden administration is fully aligned with the interests of Israel, and this connection is at the heart of U.S. policy decisions, especially in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Trump, while less overtly aligned with Israel's interests, has also failed to break free from the neoconservative and Zionist influences that dominate Washington. The idea that the U.S. is still a sovereign state is laughable. It is merely an extension of Israel's geopolitical ambitions. In the Arctic, as the U.S. attempts to ramp up its icebreaker fleet to compete with Russia's dominance in the region, it is clear that the West is outmatched. Russia's nuclear-powered icebreakers far outnumber and outperform anything the U.S. can muster. The West's attempts to challenge Russia in the Arctic are doomed to fail. The resources in the Arctic are vast, and Russia's control over this area is crucial to its long-term strategic goals. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Europe are watching as their own systems collapse. Europe is on the brink of economic collapse, and the U.S. is losing its global dominance. The sanctions on Russia and the constant push for war have only served to weaken the West. The political elites, whether in Washington or Brussels, are blind to the inevitable decline of their power. They continue to push forward with their outdated ideas, ignoring the clear signs that the world is changing. Russia, for its part, is steadily growing in strength, both militarily and economically, while the West's position continues to deteriorate. In terms of diplomacy, Russia's stance is clear. It will not negotiate away its territorial gains or its security concerns. Any talks about Ukraine's NATO membership are non-starters. Russia will continue to focus on demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, while the West flounders, unable to find any meaningful leverage. The idea that the West could somehow force Russia to the negotiating table is delusional. Russia has already won, and the longer the West continues its foolish resistance, the more damage it will do to itself. The future of Ukraine is not about the return of a sovereign state, but the continued disintegration of what remains of its territorial integrity. Russia will continue to enforce its security interests, and the West will eventually have to come to terms with the reality of Russia's dominance in the region. The sooner the West recognizes this, the better, but don't expect it to happen anytime soon. The delusions of NATO and the U.S. will continue until the world changes completely. The situation surrounding the proposed 29-point plan by the United States is not about achieving peace or resolving the conflict in Ukraine. Rather, it is a calculated move to shape how the world perceives the events that have unfolded since the Maidan coup of 2014. The U.S. and NATO have used this plan as a tool to shift the narrative and portray the conflict in a way that suits their agenda, reinforcing the idea that Russia is the aggressor while portraying Ukraine as the victim. What we are witnessing with the 29-point plan is not a legitimate peace proposal, but a propaganda effort to justify the West's actions and its support for the Ukrainian government, which has been embroiled in a series of war crimes and atrocities. The Russian government, led by President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, has made it clear time and again that the war was not initiated by Russia, but rather by the Ukrainian government and NATO-backed forces. The conflict began with the illegal overthrow of a democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014, followed by the systematic attack on Russian-speaking populations in the eastern regions of the country. From Russia's perspective, NATO and the West have long sought to weaken Russia, destabilize the region, and bring Ukraine into NATO. This was a breach of prior agreements made after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the West promised not to expand NATO further eastward. The plan proposed by the West is an attempt to obscure the historical context and rewrite the narrative surrounding the conflict, turning the tables to make Russia appear as the aggressor, when in fact it was NATO and Ukraine that initiated hostilities. The United States and NATO's attempt to present this as a peace proposal is nothing more than a cover-up for their failed military and political strategy. The idea that Ukraine could be rebuilt under NATO's leadership is a fantasy that ignores the reality on the ground. The military size proposed for Ukraine in the 29-point plan, including the goal of expanding the army to 600,000 or even 800,000 soldiers, is completely unrealistic given Ukraine's current economic and military limitations. This plan would require immense financial and military resources that the West simply does not have, and it would prolong the conflict, further drawing in European and U.S. resources. From the Russian perspective, the idea of NATO continuing to arm Ukraine to fight Russia is unacceptable. Russia has made it clear that it will not allow NATO to use Ukraine as a proxy to attack Russian interests. NATO's plan to rearm Ukraine and keep the Ukrainian government in power is not about peace, it's about continuing the war. The Russian government has already warned that it will retaliate against any country that supplies Ukraine with weapons. If NATO and the U.S. continue down this path, they risk facing direct retaliation from Russia. At the core of this conflict is the question of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia's stance is clear. It will not accept a Ukraine armed and controlled by NATO. The proposed expansion of Ukraine's military and continued Western support for the Ukrainian government is designed to keep Ukraine as a proxy battlefield for NATO's war against Russia. The reality is that Ukraine, as it currently exists, is incapable of defending itself against Russia's military power. The war has already shown that NATO cannot win against Russia in this conflict, and any attempt to continue the war would only lead to further destruction and loss of life. The true purpose of the 29-point plan is not to negotiate peace, but to shift the narrative in favor of the West and Ukraine, NATO and the U.S. Want to frame the war as a battle against Russian aggression, even though the truth is that NATO's expansion eastward and the Western-backed coup in Ukraine have been the root causes of this conflict. The West is using this narrative to rally support for further sanctions, military aid, and diplomatic pressure against Russia, while ignoring the reality that the conflict was instigated by NATO and the Ukrainian government. One of the key issues that Russia has raised throughout this conflict is the question of war crimes. Russia has repeatedly stated that the Ukrainian government has committed atrocities against its own people, particularly in the Donbas region, where ethnic Russians have been targeted and persecuted. Russia's goal in this conflict is to protect the Russian-speaking population and prevent further war crimes. In this context, the idea of a blanket amnesty for those responsible for these crimes, as proposed in the 29-point plan, is unacceptable. Russia has already indicated that it will hold a modern-day Nuremberg trial to bring war criminals to justice. This is crucial for establishing the historical record and ensuring that those responsible for the war crimes are held accountable. Meanwhile, the Western-backed narrative tries to obscure the true nature of the conflict by portraying Russia as the aggressor and the Ukrainian government as the victim. This is a deliberate attempt to whitewash the corruption and war crimes of the Ukrainian government, which has been supported by NATO and the West. The Ukrainian government, including President Zelensky, has been embroiled in widespread corruption, using international aid and loans to enrich themselves and fund their war efforts. The West has turned a blind eye to this corruption, choosing instead to support Ukraine's regime and its fight against Russia, all while perpetuating the narrative of Russian aggression. The war in Ukraine is also about reparations. The 29-point plan proposes that Russia pay reparations to Ukraine for the destruction caused by the war. However, this is a distorted view of the situation. The reality is that Ukraine and NATO should be paying reparations to Russia for the damage caused by their actions. Russia has been forced to defend itself against an illegal attack, and the destruction caused by NATO's support for Ukraine should be compensated by the West. The seizure of Russian assets by NATO countries is part of this larger effort to rewrite history and justify the continued demonization of Russia. The proposed NATO-backed solution is an attempt to create a new order in Ukraine, one that would be controlled by the West and used as a launching pad for further attacks against Russia. The goal is to weaken Russia economically, politically, and militarily, and to break up the country into smaller pieces that can be easily controlled by Western powers. This is the same strategy that was used in the 990 seconds to privatize Russian assets and open the country to Western exploitation. The West has been unsuccessful in its attempts to destabilize Russia through military means, and now it is trying to achieve its goals through economic warfare and manipulation of the global narrative. The reality is that Russia is winning this war, and any attempt to prolong the conflict will only lead to further suffering and destruction. The 29-point plan is nothing more than a propaganda tool designed to justify NATO's failure and to shift the blame onto Russia. The West cannot win this war, and the sooner they recognize this reality, the better it will be for everyone. As for Ukraine's future in Europe, the question is whether Europe can afford to accept Ukraine as a member given its current political, economic, and military state. The migration crisis, exacerbated by the war, is already putting a strain on European countries, and the influx of Ukrainian refugees will only add to the burden. Many Europeans are already opposed to the idea of accepting large numbers of refugees, and the growing nationalism across the continent will only make it more difficult for Ukraine to be integrated into the European Union. Furthermore, Ukraine's corruption, its failed economy, and its dependence on NATO and Western aid make it an unsustainable member of Europe. In conclusion, the proposed peace plan is not about achieving peace. It's about shaping the narrative and justifying the West's actions. The war in Ukraine is the result of NATO's expansionism, and Russia is determined to protect its sovereignty and security. The West's efforts to prolong the conflict will only lead to further instability, and the reality is that Russia is winning. The future of Ukraine lies in the hands of its people, but it is clear that they have no chance of winning this war against Russia with the support of NATO and the West. The sooner the West accepts this reality, the better it will be for everyone involved.